of the 20th century were among the deadliest entities in human history. Tens of millions of people lost their lives as a result of these regimes, who unleashed devastation in almost every corner of the globe. Many of these crimes meet the definition of genocide. Genocide is any attempt to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in a variety of ways, including but not limited to the murder of the group's members, destroying its families, and creating conditions designed to bring about a group's destruction. Multiple communist regimes pursued genocidal policy against those who dared to oppose their revolution. In this video, we'll expose the 5-step playbook for how communists pursued these genocides. The first step in any genocide is to identify the victims. Communist regimes based their persecution mainly on ideology. Their enemies were defined chiefly as class enemies, marked out from the working class by their alleged wealth and power. Given that most communist nations were formed after revolution, the old pre-revolutionary elite was a natural target. Landowners, businessmen, former officials, military officers, and anyone else who wielded power under the old order was immediately suspect. Communists also considered organized religion to be a serious obstacle to the revolution, as it offered alternative ideas of morality and community to those the state wanted to create. Religious people, especially religious leaders, became a common target as a result. While communism viewed the world through the lens of class, it could not erase the ethnic and racial hatred ingrained in many societies. Communist genocides often carried a strain of racial and ethnic hatred anyway. Communist rhetoric would repackage these attitudes with an appropriate communist presentation. It wasn't that an ethnic group was being targeted for their race or culture, but because they were all actually capitalist traitors working against the revolution, the communists claimed. The long list of enemies of the people drawn up by the Bolsheviks upon seizing power in Russia demonstrates the many ways communists designated people for destruction. Within weeks of seizing power in October 1917, the Bolsheviks were drawing up lists of class enemies, who they accused of opposing the revolution. A public proclamation in late November highlighted, quote, high-ranking functionaries in state administration, banks, the treasury, the railways, and the post and telegraph offices, as enemies of the people. Lists of the names of these class enemies were posted in public places for all to see. Political rivals such as the Constitutional Democratic Party were added to the lists, as were members of the pre-revolutionary judiciary and a large portion of the existing military officers. All of these targets were specifically labeled as enemies of the people and accused of various acts including sabotage and profiting from the misery of others. The Bolsheviks repackaged ethnic hatred with communist rhetoric. The communists believed they were entitled to control all of the former Russian Empire, no matter if its provinces wanted to leave. Poles, Ukrainians, and other ethnic minorities who dared to push for independence were labeled as class traitors, imperialist stooges, and capitalist exploiters who were trying to undermine the revolution. Another striking feature of communist genocides is that the victims are always identified as the aggressors. When Lenin gave a speech on May 5, 1920, to the Red Army soldiers preparing to leave to invade Poland, he blamed Polish landowners and capitalists for forcing the war on Russia. In every genocide, the regime made sure to link their victims with the hated class enemies and foreign powers. The communists saw themselves as the permanent underdog, striking back against the sinister agents of capitalism and imperialism. Even as they marched crying children to mass graves, the communists claimed they were doing their part to rid the world of bourgeois tyranny. After identifying which groups had to be targeted, the next step was to isolate them in preparation for persecution. Communist regimes cast themselves as being the will of the people. Therefore, any victim of genocide had to be separated from the people first. This could be done physically, with deportation and exile for the victims, and rhetorically, by producing propaganda that defined the victims identified in step 1 as the other. Labels like enemy of the people and class traitor signaled that the targets were not part of the communist revolution, and therefore not of the people. If they weren't part of the people, then they didn't need to be treated like people either. A typical example was seen in Laos with the Hmong genocide. The Hmong were a minority group in the country who had mostly converted to Christianity during the period of French colonialism. During the long Laotian Civil War, many Hmong took up arms to fight the communists, fearing that a communist regime would persecute them for their faith. After the Pathet Lao communist regime seized power in 1975, that's exactly what happened. The new regime labeled the entire Hmong population as hostile, capitalist traitors, the running dogs of imperialism, as one official called them, and isolated them from the new nation. No distinction was made between actual anti-communist guerrillas and civilians, nor were women, children, or the elderly spared. Every Hmong was to be treated as an enemy. In the words of the Pathet Lao's official newspaper, the Hmong would have to be exterminated to the last root. Thousands of Hmong fled their homes and made for the Thai border. And no doubt this was the point of making these public declarations, while those who remained were physically removed from the rest of the population. Tens of thousands of Hmong were rounded up by the military. They were taken from their land and moved to isolated rural villages, where they were made to live in poorly made shacks on land that could not support them. The Laotian government refused to provide food, and only US aid drops prevented their total starvation. Several thousand Hmong were reportedly sent to special camps in the jungles for re-education, although many would never return. This isolation also took them away from the prying eyes of journalists and human rights groups who would struggle to keep an eye on the Hmong in the dense Laotian jungles. The goal was to isolate the Hmong socially, physically, and even in terms of food supply. The Laotian government made it clear that the Hmong were not welcome and were not even considered worthy of living. In the coming months and years, the Pathet Lao would unleash massacres, bombing campaigns, and chemical weapons on the isolated Hmong communities. The groundwork for further violence and persecution, which continues in Laos to this day, had been securely laid. The victims have been identified and isolated. Now, the tools of the genocide must be mobilized to bring about its actual execution. Steps 1 and 2 primed the victims and the masses for the genocide, but step 3 prepared the perpetrators. Lists had to be drawn up, plans made, and men gathered together to execute them. This phase would often include the interpretation of the target group's leadership, so that the victims would find it hard to resist when the killings began. Take the Soviet Union's actions in Ukraine as an example. Not only did Ukraine have an emerging nationalist movement that wanted to be free of Soviet control, but it was also home to around 71,000 families classed as kulaks. Kulaks were land-owning peasants who Lenin treated as capitalist traitors. Lenin and the other Bolshevik leaders believed that kulaks and the Ukrainians as a whole might resist communism, so took brutal measures to terrorize them. In August 1918, Lenin personally ordered the public hanging of 100 kulaks in the Pensa region for resisting the collectivization of farmland. He ordered their names to be widely publicized to spread fear across Ukraine, and discourage any further resistance. Over the following years, Soviet authorities continued trying to suppress the kulaks, with mixed success. Then, in December 1929, Stalin decided enough was enough and ordered the total liquidation of the kulaks as a class. So began the formal organization of the genocide. Soviet authorities sorted the kulaks into 3 classes and planned the actions to be taken against each group. Category 1 were the kulaks guilty of actual counter-revolutionary activity and would be sent to gulags or shot. Those who did not resist but did not show loyalty to the communist regime were Category 2. They'd be deported and have their property confiscated. Lastly, Category 3 were those who were loyal to the regime and would just be deported. Such plans required the cooperation of many arms of the state. The Soviet secret police would need to draw up the names of the more resistant kulaks in Category 1. Meanwhile, local activists would be dispatched to draw up lists of Category 2 and 3 in every village. Since there weren't that many local activists, the regime dispatched a trusted party member and assigned him local peasant assistants to create a list. These lists turned genocidal rhetoric into genocidal blueprints. They would soon be used to arrange the deportation of 1.8 million alleged kulaks and the deaths of at least 500,000 of them. This desolation of the farming population soon produced a massive famine, which claimed millions more Ukrainian lives. Step 3 had led naturally into Step 4. Step 4 is the obvious one: eliminate. Having identified the enemy, isolated them from power and protection, and organized the tools of the genocide, it was time to execute it. There is probably no method of murder that wasn't seen somewhere during communist genocides. Most people will think of the direct methods: firing squads and executions of bound and frightened civilians. This was certainly the fate of millions. Deaths in forced labor camps through exhaustion, disease, or starvation was another common fate. A great many were subjected to torture from the regimes, both as a matter of policy and the sadistic whims of local officials or soldiers. Starvation, intentional or not, would also claim an immense share of the communist death toll. While many of these deaths would have been carried out by state security forces, communist powers often employed volunteer militias, drawn largely from the enthusiastic youth, like Mao's Red Guards. The demonization and social isolation of the victims in Steps 1 and 2 meant that there were usually lots of volunteers primed to hate the victims and eager to play their role. As an example, we can turn to Ethiopia. In the mid-1970s, the Marxist-Leninist Derg regime of Mengistu Haile Mariam carried out the extermination of hundreds of thousands of political enemies. The targets were drawn from a variety of designated enemy groups, including regional separatists and pre-revolutionary elites, such as the supporters of the deposed Emperor Haile Selassie. However, the primary targets were actually rival communist groups in the All-Ethiopia Socialist Movement, who were mostly from the persecuted Oromo ethnic group, and the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, EPRP. Having designated these groups as enemies of the revolution, Mengistu famously smashed 3 vials of blood during a speech in April 1976 as a signal to unleash the killings. This campaign of terror was known as the Ki Shibir. The Mengistu regime unleashed plenty of soldiers to do their dirty work, but they also employed civilian death squads, known as Kebele, to round up and murder their enemies. The Kebele were historically neighborhood organizations that existed long before the genocide, but the regime appropriated them as a tool for extermination. They had little training or organization. They were essentially handed rifles with the promise that they'd use them on the regime's enemies, then set loose on innocent people. The targets were usually rounded up first and killed en masse. Aside from regime soldiers and the Kebele, there were even reports of Soviet troops helping their ally by rounding up student activists to be executed. Reports of mass burnings, torture in captivity, and rape demonstrated just how diverse the horrors could be. One of the distinctive execution methods used in the Kishibir was strangulation by a nylon rope, which got the nickname of the Mengistu bow tie. The method was a particular favorite of the regime's chief of internal security, Colonel Teka Tulu. This method was used to execute thousands of victims, most famously the deposed Emperor Haile Selassie, who was strangled to death in his home in August 1975. As was the case with so many genocides, the killers did not keep meticulous lists of who they killed, so the scale of the deaths are open for debate. Defenders of the regime put the death toll as low as 10,000 people killed in 2 years. Most estimates go into the hundreds of thousands, perhaps as high as 1 million. The difficulty in determining the number owes in part to step 5, denial.
Two generations of magicians brought together for a reason. The closer they look, the less they'll actually see. 3, 2, 1.